Right. We are looking at Lord Byron's closet drama Cain in the second and third acts today. The last time we looked at this topic, I discussed a variety of things, among others, the general portrait of the hero Cain himself, who follows the general guidelines of what we call the Byronic hero, a type and a personality type, which I mentioned, at least in a briefer video, is characteristic of many of the portraits of the heroes of modern fiction, namely in battling for justice against the conventions and, in their minds, the arbitrary conventions of the law. So justice versus law is one of the principal claims to rectitude there. And Byron, in this account, has brought us to introduce a couple of figures, principal figures at any rate, and the principal figures are Cain and, of course, Lucifer. And we saw in the last discussion of this that we had a very angry man here. Angry at Cain's angry at God. He's angry at his mother. He's angry at Adam, his father, for not eating from the tree of life, and he's mad at Abel for being a subservient type of fellow, and he is nothing of the sort. And so we see in this a portrait of Cain as a sort of an admirable figure, and with that, a figure who is something like Satan himself, at least in Milton's conception, a very proud figure. And in Byron's own estimation, that is precisely what he sought to represent. So in one of his letters, and I will read from it here, Byron states that Cain is a proud man. If Lucifer promised him kingdoms, etc., it would elate him. The object of the demon is to depress him still further in his own estimation than he was before, by showing him infinite things, and his own abasement, till he falls into the frame of mind that leads him to the catastrophe. From mere internal irritation, not premeditation or envy of Abel, which Byron goes on to say would have made him contemptible, but rather from rage and fury against the inadequacy of his state to his own conceptions, and which just charges itself rather than against life and the author of life than the mere living thereof. And so his subsequent remorse is the natural effect of looking on his sudden deed. And whereas had the deed been premeditated, his repentance would have been far tardier than Byron portrays it as. So Byron wants Cain to be seen as a proud figure, and furthermore wants to, I would say, take it away from the biblical account in which God's judgment on Cain's offering is what precipitates the catastrophe. He removes that aspect from the account, and so he takes certain liberties from the text. So in just to anticipate things here a little bit, in Act 3, Abel asks Cain to join him at sacrifice, and a column of fire ascends from Abel's altar into heaven, but a whirlwind destroys Cain's altar, and Abel tries to repair his altar, and Cain kills him in the argument that ensues. But note that there's no judgment on God's behalf there in that account that Byron gives. And of course, this is a departure from the text, and a significant one, because in the biblical account, it's God's actions that are in some sense precipitating things, whereas here it's just a random accident per se. And so there's less of a God's involvement in the and foreknowledge of the whole process. And so these are significant things. What I want to propose here in looking at Acts 2 and 3, because in Acts 2 and 3 we get the development of something very interesting, to my mind at any rate, and novel about this approach and this Manichaean portrait, which we see here, just as we did in Percy Bysshe Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, this idea of the good and the evil, these principles at work. And again, I said this was true of Shelley in general. His portrait tends towards Manichaeanism of good and evil powers at work. In Byron, he adds to that by referencing various scientific discoveries of his day, in particular that of Georges Cuvier. Cuvier is a naturalist and zoologist in France, sometimes regarded as even the very father of paleontology, so the discovery of old things, instrumental in the research of the day. He compares living animals with fossils, so lots of the discoveries there, and important ones being made at the time. And most influentially here and importantly is that he is the most famous proponent of catastrophism in geology. And catastrophism, I need to mention, is not popular in this day, so I need to say something about this. It's the idea that the Earth has been marked by sudden, very short-lived violent events, and often perhaps even global in their scope, and that civilizations, whole societies had been destroyed in catastrophes, and this will play into the portrait that we will see in Act 2 of Cain, where when we go back in time, we will see that there are various ages that had been buried and so forth. But the general English portrait that arises out of paleontology was marked by the theory of uniformitarianism. That's a little bit better. Or gradualism, in which there are slow incremental changes like erosion that mark the Earth's geological figures or features. And nowadays, I think in general, the gradual uniformitarianism marks the scientific field. And with this, the theory of evolution that comes along. It's a very slow-moving process. But Byron is not working with that. He is working with the idea of violent, catastrophic events in his portrait here. But that only reflects upon his portrait of time, and that's in the second part of Act 2. What he does in the first part of Act 2 is to deal with the concept of space. And here's where I want to say a few things which I think are also important, and they bear on this understanding of knowledge that occurs in Romanticism in general. And it's not just true of Romanticism, it is to some degree true of the Whig historicist movement as well. So let me say a little bit about that. In the Whig view of history, history is making progress. The past from which we have emerged is not only distant, but is inferior to us, and our knowledge is superior to that of the past. And the account of history is that of the arc of human progress, moving from a benighted beginning where men drag women around by the hair and so forth, the portrait of the caveman. So the characteristic portrait of the past is a time of terrific ignorance, moving through those four ages, from that of the poetic age to the religious age to the philosophic age to the scientific age. These are the four ages of poetry, four ages of knowledge that Percy Shelley responds to in his defense of poetry. And with that, there's an emancipation of mankind, a movement from darkness to light, as it were. And so the Enlightenment is standing now on the pinnacle of human history, looking downwards and backwards upon its benighted forebears. And with that in mind, there is actually, it's not that the history isn't worth studying, it's that what is most important and most informative is actually to look towards the future. And by looking to the future, it's also looking away from the historical lived experiences of human ancestry. And so it's going to discount the knowledge and pedagogy, furthermore, of education that had existed amongst human beings up to this point. So there's a decisive shift here, which I catalog in my book, Romanticism, Hermeneutics, and the Crisis of the Human Sciences, in which the humanities themselves are altered by a quasi-scientific approach to the study not only of the natural world, but also of human beings themselves. And the so-called Geisteswissenschaft, and the German word, which I've translated as the human sciences, although Geist in German actually refers to spiritual, so a correct translation would probably be the spiritual sciences. And that reflects the sort of the Gnosticism that we can mark here in the shift away from the old humanities disciplines, in which we seek to preserve and recover lost knowledge, which was true, and move away from that essentially conservative project towards a progressive project in which we are seeking to be emancipated from the past, and emancipated from the thing that most prominently marks it, at least in the language of the Enlightenment figures, namely its non-thinking acceptance of what authority has taught. And what authority has taught is it has inculcated prejudices. And the Enlightenment project regards prejudice as by its very nature, an evil that we seek to transcend by avoiding, by a methodology of progress, looking away from prejudices and embracing what Immanuel Kant calls pure reason. So in his little treatise, What is Enlightenment?, Kant defines it very early on there, and says that, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's something along the lines of the refusal to accept on authority what somebody else has said. It's the, I think, the escape from man's self-imposed tutelage to the past, and it embraces the motto sapere aude, dare to know. And so there's a quite self-conscious, not only rejection of the past, but an embrace of a spirit of adventure and so forth. And we can see this having been portrayed already in the course in the scientist Victor Frankenstein, and also of Walton, as he goes into the Arctic regions and so forth. He's doing that for humanitarian reasons. He is an Enlightenment scientist, effectively. And the science in the late 18th century and the early 19th centuries is marked by this same tendency, and it is to this very day. But what comes from this, and the consequence of this, this attempt to enlighten, and this view of history, this progressive view of history, is somewhat ironic, given the context of the play Cain and the general claim of the Romantics to be bringing in a more progressive view of human nature than that of their illustrious forebears, like Mr. John Milton. Because remember, we've seen throughout the entire course that Milton's Paradise Lost and his defense of freedom, his opposition to the tyranny of Charles I, all of these things were made Milton himself a heroic figure to the Romantics. And yet we've seen also that characteristic of the era and the writers in the era is their rejection of his Christian faith, and the tenets in particular of the Christian faith, and the move towards the tendencies both of Manichaean portraits of evil, and also a Gnostic belief in the power of the imagination to unify the sensory perceptions and do so in a way that will provide a more progressive and more universal and more liberating perspective on human life, and that will allow us to live in conjunction with nature. Nature, which here is then posited a somewhat supernatural status in the certainly in the rendering of Wordsworth. But let me just say something about this universality that the Romantics present to us here, and I'll do it a little bit by a little bit of backtracking here. And by comparison, it's something that struck me years ago when I read C.S. Lewis's work, The Discarded Image, which is a book I highly recommend and taught when I presented my own course on C.S. Lewis. I took 3 lectures to do this. But in the middle chapters of that book, he describes the cosmology of the medieval world, which they inherited from the classical world. And that cosmology was based on the idea that the Earth was at the center of a cosmos of planets, and these planets stood in relation to the Earth and passed around it in something akin to concentric spheres. So this, you could call this a geocentric cosmology. And in the center of all that, as I say, was the Earth and the planets revolving around it. And up and above them, at the very top of all of this, would be the primum mobile, the prime mover that was moving all of the planets in relation to one another, so that we could perceive, and to this day our English language suggests the old cosmology, we could see the sun rise and the sun set. So from the vantage points of a still fixed point, everything is moving around us. That's how the our natural senses and the old cosmological understanding used to work. We are not moving, everything else is moving around us. Come the 16th century, Nicholas Copernicus and his views of cosmology have challenged this, and they were corroborated by Galileo, that the cosmos is actually heliocentric and not geocentric. We are moving, the planets are actually revolving around the sun, the helios in Greek, the Greek word for sun, and as a consequence, we are moving at great speed. And the Earth is revolving around its axis, but nonetheless, we are moving around the Earth. Well, this leads to a great subversion of the old form of knowledge. In my book, as I say, delves into this to some degree, the consequences of this shift, because it's quite profound. Because in the old way of understanding knowledge, everything was integrated, and cosmology was one of the 4 pillars of the quadrivium, along with arithmetic, geometry, and music. These 4 things were connected, interconnected. And likewise, the trivium, the 7 liberal arts, were all interconnected, and they worked and encompassed all knowledge. So to pull out one of the pillars of that view of knowledge would have an invariable effect on all the rest. And I, as I say, I try to describe that in my lectures and in my book to some extent. But what the effect is here, most importantly, is to adopt a new cosmology. Is not simply to say, we're going to say that the Earth is now actually in a heliocentric universe. It's to no longer trust our senses at all to deliver us knowledge. And instead, we have to follow what René Descartes calls his method of doubt. We have to doubt what we can see with our own eyes, and we have to instead trust on things that we can be certain about. And what are those things that we can be certain about? Well, we can be certain about the mind's cogitations, our thinking. We think, therefore we are, and so forth. So it's a method of doubting. And it's a universal one. It's the universal method of doubt, which gives rise to a certain certainty which comes about through science and the demonstrations through a verification of facts and so forth. So truth is replaced by facts. Truth and facts are not the same thing. They are related, but they are not the same thing. And in this day, in Byron's day, again, the facts that are being uncovered by the paleontologists are giving rise to certain theories about what the actual origins of life are, and what the excavations of archaeology and so forth are revealing. And with them, then various theories, ranging from Cuvier's catastrophism to the uniformitarianism, which is most commonly adhered to in our day. But all of these are nonetheless share in common this universal view of knowledge, which is not going to trust the intellectual inheritance, or for that matter, the revealed word of God as it is in Scripture, but rather are going to doubt everything and make an assessment based on what we can conjecture about. And this universal perspective is then relativizing all claims of knowledge save those of our own. And so the historicism that marks this same period is has this feature of making all claims to knowledge that precede us to announce that they are only relatively true, and they are no longer true for us. So it's the universal method of doubt. And as it's as it were to take the view from nowhere, to use Thomas Nagel's phrase. We are literally looking from nowhere. We're looking outside the conditions of space and time in which knowledge had hitherto been followed, and we are replacing that way of knowing and understanding with one which purports to be superior. It purports to be superior. It purports to be that of the method of pure reasoning. But what I noted in my own book, and what we can see here, characteristic of not only this particular play, but also of the whole Romantic project, is that it has a prejudice against prejudice. So when it seeks to eradicate prejudice and to move beyond prejudice, the prejudice of being in space and time, what it's doing is adopting a universal prejudice against all prejudices, pronouncing all prejudices to be ipso facto evil, and furthermore to having no basis in truth. And the effect of that is to hollow out not only are the views of the past, but in particular, even the conditions of human nature, the specific, bodily, personal views of human life. And so what we see in this period is an attack on human nature itself, and an attack on human personhood, not just divine personhood. We've already seen that in my first lecture here on Cain, that the personhood of God, his tri-personal nature, which is a necessity for Christian theology, that God is in his very person, his tri-personal nature, loving, and he is transcendent outside space and time, not implicated in the creation, which he called good because he himself is good. None of those things are being represented in Byron's conception. So these are all theological heresies, and they were received as such in his day, and his publisher John Murray was attacked for precisely the theological heresies that are being presented in Byron's text. My point is that there is a further consequence to Byron's portrait of the story of Cain and Abel. It's not just the departures from the biblical text. I can accept those to some degree. It's a work of art. He's exploring an idea. That's fine. It's more the effect anthropologically on this. What is the view of nature that is going to result from this universal perspective in which human nature itself is being seen as a prejudice to be eradicated? Human personhood. And we already talked about how that plays itself out in Shelley's view of life in his little essay on life, in which he talks about the very personal nature, which is reflected in our grammar of the pronouns I and you and he, she, it, first person singular, second person singular, third person singular, aren't really genuine differences. He says, but they're modifications of the one mind. That's what Shelley says. I also think this is an implication that bites across the romantic universal perspective on life. And Byron here in this Act 2 represents it by taking Cain into the far reaches of the galaxy and looking upon the Earth as this small and seemingly insignificant little planet, which he is horrified by. So he takes him into the abyss of space. Now, this word space is also telling, because as Lewis notes in the discarded image, the old cosmology, when the medieval man, the ancient world, looked up upon the heavens, they saw something firm and fixed and beautiful. The word cosmos, the same word as the word from which we get cosmetics. It suggests beauty. It has those connotations. It's a beautiful thing, it's a fixed thing, and it's something that we relate to. To be clear, it is great and far above us, but it is not something that is absent of anything. But that idea of a space, a vacuity, of nothing personal, nothing relational in the heavens above us, that is the consequence of the new cosmology. And Byron follows this in presenting an abyss in space from the vantage point of which the Earth is small and insignificant, and as a consequence, Cain himself is small and insignificant. And then when he moves on towards the, as I say, the second part of Act 2, Scene 1, he also then travels back in time, where he sees the Earth as a beautiful place, and that had been destroyed nonetheless, and destroyed through catastrophes, suggesting that there was no meaning or purpose to life. It was just simply something that was beautiful that was being destroyed. And as a consequence, of course, the portrait that Lucifer paints of God at the outset, that he should be considered to be a destroyer more than a creator, gains traction in Cain's mind. Now, if we were speaking live at this point, I'd invite your responses here, but I'll be able to do that in class. Still, it would be helpful here, but we have to deal with the situation we're in right now. But I think you can see that vantage point that Cain, or rather Byron, takes upon the Earth is this precisely what Thomas Nagel calls the view from nowhere. It's the conditions of life which were not subject to the conditions of life. It's a view of science and a view of reason in which human nature has no actual physical substance, in which the human body is rendered an obstacle and having nothing to do with our physical nature. Our nature is in fact associated purely with our act of will. And only in those things that we will is our human nature to be understood and expressed. And we can see this in our day, I think, in modern transhumanist projects. But I will say one final thing on this, and that is that C.S. Lewis, I think, is writing on this very topic when he comes to write The Abolition of Man in 1945. Right. Actually, he delivered in a series of 3 lectures in 43, but it's published in 1945, in which he talks about how the humanities have effectively been abolished by this new view of human nature, in which the judgments of the past of what is good and true and beautiful are considered to be merely a subjective impression. And Lewis notes, with that word merely, the implications are entirely clear. Goodness, beauty, and truth are subjective impressions. And with that, Lewis says, the whole of the humanities tradition, and not just the humanities, but every religion, is being undermined in the process. Because what we are doing is effectively relativizing those claims and asserting that they are merely subjective in the face of a superior approach, which is that of the sciences, which purport to be objective, rational, and progressive. And he then goes on to describe that in the other aspects of that. But that's not my text here. I simply want to note and draw to a conclusion that that train of thought, which I think is relevant to this vantage point that we're given here in Byron's Cain. So it concludes there, as I say, in Act 2, Scene 1, with the view of the earth in its former beauty. And then he concludes Act 2, Scene 1 by taking Cain to the gates of Hades. Now, Cain, when he goes to see the gates of Hades, is simply horrified by what he sees, this realm of death. Remember, at this point, or the way that the play began, Cain was angry at the fact that he'd been told that he would die for reasons that were, to his mind, unjust, because he had done nothing. It was his parents who had done it. So why should he be judged? Why should he be limited in that way? He's a proud spirit. And now he sees death, and he sees phantoms flying around him, the spirits of beings that God had made and destroyed before he had even made mankind. So a shadowy underworld type of portrait, the portrait that you would find more common in Homer and Virgil, except he's added to it something of the vision, I think, of Dante, because the spirits are flying around rather than shadowy, insubstantial figures walking around the way we see it in Homer's portrait, for instance, in what is it, Book 11 of the Odyssey. When Cain sees these dead spirits flying around, he is so disgusted that he simply wants to die, and says to Lucifer, let me just stay here. And so he would rather, I mean, he's almost echoing Milton's Satan when he says that he would rather be reign in hell than serve on earth. So it's a dim echo of that. And then Lucifer responds to him that you can't stay here quite yet, but you will. Don't worry, you'll get there. I'll get you there. So and then Act 3, Scene 1. And I realize I'm going over this rather in a superficial, cursory manner, but I think it helps to take a broader view rather than get into the grainy details, although I think the language is quite splendid in the play. And I said it was a closet drama and did not lend itself to the stage very well, but it has been tried. The famous director Stanislavski sought to do it. I think it's been tried a few times, and I don't think any of the times have succeeded very well. But Act 3, Scene 1 brings us to the scene that we associate most strongly with Cain, in which Cain and his sister / wife, but again, note Byron's language always emphasizes that she's his sister to bring to the audience's mind the original state of the two there, and the fact that it had not yet been condemned, that is incest, as a grievous moral crime, and Byron thereby suggesting that this is a relativistic judgment, a social judgment, but doesn't reflect or merit our true human nature. You can see why this would scandalize. But he has the two of them, Cain and Ada, looking upon their sleeping son Enoch. And Enoch, as we know in Scripture, walked with God and then was no more. He pleased him. Another figure, Enoch. But when Enoch smiles, Cain's comment on this is that he is smiling because he's too young and innocent to know that paradise is lost. And therefore, I guess, that he would be in such a state as Cain was, that is outraged, because of course it's just that he should be outraged. Note in all of this from the beginning, Cain's outrage, as I said, is rather dramatically implausible, because when he rails against the fact that he's due to die, he doesn't even know what death is. Now, when he comes to Act 2 and the view from the abyss of space, Act 2, Scene 2, and then comes into the gates of Hades and sees the dead flying around, then he has more of a sense of this. But even there, the portrait of the dead is of the realm of a shadowy insubstantial place, which has, as I say, more in common with the gates, with Dante's view of Paradiso than it does of the classical world's conception of the underworld. But he says that he's too young and innocent to know that paradise is lost, and he actually considers killing him so that he wouldn't be miserable as he is. And his wife / sister chastises him. The play moves on and comes to the crisis point when we see Cain and Abel at the point of sacrifice. And I'll see if I can pick it up here and read some excerpts. I've skipped over a great deal here because of the necessity of time. But let me see here. Enter Abel. This is, so Act 3, Scene 1, line 163. Abel. Welcome, Cain, my brother, the peace of God be on thee. Cain. Abel, hail. Abel. Our sister tells me that thou hast been wandering in high communion with a spirit far beyond our wonted range. Was he of those we have seen and spoken with, like to our father? No. Why then commune with him? He may be a foe to the Most High, Cain, and friend to man. Has the Most High been so? If so, you term him? Term him? Your words are strange today, my brother. My sister, Ada, leave us for a while. We mean to sacrifice. Farewell, my Cain, says Ada, but first embrace thy son. May his soft spirit and Abel's pious ministry recall thee to peace and holiness. So now we have Abel and Cain left on the stage. So then Abel back to him. Where hast thou been? Cain, I know not. Where, nor what thou hast seen? Cain, the dead, the immortal, the unbounded, the omnipotent, the overpowering mysteries of space, the innumerable worlds that were and are, a whirlwind of such overwhelming things, suns, moons, and spheres, and earths upon their loud voice spheres singing in thunder around me, as have made me unfit for mortal concourse, or converse rather. Leave me, Abel. Abel, thine eyes are flashing with unnatural light. Thy cheek is flushed with an unnatural hue. Thy words are fraught with an unnatural sound. What may this mean? Note the language here of unnatural. This is something unnatural, playing in a sense on the sort of language of nature that Shakespeare uses in King Lear, the nature of one brother as opposed to the other. And there's something unnatural about this. And with that word nature, something immoral is being intended by your words here, and blasphemous, furthermore, is recognized by Cain. And Cain responds by saying, it means, I pray thee, leave me. Not till we have prayed and sacrificed together, says Abel. Abel, I pray thee, sacrifice alone. Jehovah loves thee well. Abel, both well, I hope, but thee the better. I care not for that. Thou art fitter for his worship than I am. Note the condescension in his language here. Revere him then, but let it be alone, at least without me. Brother, I should ill deserve the name of our great father's son, if as my elder I revered thee not, and in the worship of our God called not on thee to join me, and precede me in our priesthood. 'Tis thy place, Cain, but I have ne'er asserted it. The more my grief. I pray thee do so now. Thy soul seems laboring in some strong delusion. It will calm thee. No, nothing can calm me more. Calm, say I? Never, never knew I was what calm was in the soul, although I have seen the elements stilled. My Abel, leave me, or let me leave thee to thy pious purpose. Neither, we must perform our task together. Spurn me not, If it must be so, well then, what shall I do? Choose one of those 2 altars. Choose for me. They to me are so much turf and stone. Choose thou. I have chosen. 'Tis the highest, and suits thee as the elder. Now prepare thine offerings. Where are thine? Behold them there, the firstlings of the flock, and fat thereof, a shepherd's humble offering. I have no flocks, says Cain. I am a tiller of the ground, and must yield what it yieldeth to my toil. Its fruit, he gathers fruits. Behold them in their various bloom and ripeness. They dress their altars and kindle a flame upon them. Abel, my brother, as the elder, offer first thy prayer and thanksgiving with sacrifice. Cain, no, I am new to this. Lead thou the way, and I will follow as I may. Abel, kneeling. O God, who made us, and who breathed the breath of life within our nostrils, who hath blessed us and spared, despite our father's sin, to make his children all lost, as they might have been, had not thy justice been so tempered with mercy, which is thy delight, as to accord a pardon like a paradise, compared with our great crimes. Sole Lord of light, of good and glory and eternity, without whom all were evil, and with whom none can err, except to some good end of thine omnipotent benevolence, inscrutable, but still to be fulfilled. Accept from out thy humble first of shepherds, first of the firstborn flocks, an offering, in itself nothing, as what offering can be aught with thee, but yet accept it for the thanksgiving of him who spreads it in the face of the high heaven, bowing his own even to the dust, of which he is, in honor of thee and of thy name forevermore. Cain, standing erect throughout this speech. Spirit, whate'er or whosoe'er thou art, omnipotent it may be, and if good, shown in the exemption of thy deeds from evil, Jehovah upon earth, and God in heaven, and it may be with other names, because thine attributes seem many, as thy works. If thou must be propitiated with prayers, take them. If thou must be induced with altars, and softened with a sacrifice, receive them. 2 beings here erect upon them unto thee. If thou lovest blood, the shepherd's shrine, which smokes on thy right hand, my right hand, hath shed it for thy service in the first of his flock, whose limbs now reek in sanguinary incense to thy skies. Or if the earth, if the sweet and blooming fruits of the earth and milder seasons which the unsustained turf I spread them on now offers in the face of the broad sun which ripen them, may seem good to thee, inasmuch as they have not suffered in limb or life, and rather form a sample of thy works, than supplication to look on ours. If a shrine without victim, an altar without gore, may win thy favor, look on it. And for him who dresseth it, he is such as thou madest him, and seeks nothing which must be won by kneeling. If he is evil, strike him. Thou art omnipotent, and mayest, for what can he oppose? If he be good, strike him, or spare him, if as thou wilt, since all rests upon thee. And good and evil seem to have no power themselves, save in thy will. And whether that be good or ill, I know not being omnipotent, nor fit to judge omnipotence, but merely to endure its mandate, which thus far I have endured. And of course, at this point, after this long blasphemous speech, Abel's sacrifice is consumed by fire, as I said, and Cain's is spirited away by the air. In other words, rejected. And there is no sense other than that this has happened. But note the language that is used by Cain here suggests the injustice of God, and the fact that God himself does not even follow in the templates of our understanding of good and evil. He is above good and evil. The divine edicts to do certain things, he says, are not comporting with any sense of what C.S. Lewis will call the Tao. And so Byron, although he is inveighing against what I think we could see as the view from nowhere, which regards moral good and moral evil as effectively subjective matters of subjective opinion, nonetheless, he articulates that same view and projects it onto God, making God into a cosmic power, to be sure, of omnipotence, but not of goodness, which is how he began it at first, his whole conception. And again, behind this, we can see the view of good and evil, which characterized the Romantic Sublime, which we already spent some time in the class looking at various points, in fact, leaning all the way back to Edmund Burke, where he differentiates, in fact, categorically differentiates the beautiful from the sublime. They have nothing to do with one another. The sublime is a power over us in the face of which we are terrified, because it's an impersonal sense. It's a universal sense. It has no boundaries. It suggests limitlessness. Again, the way God himself is portrayed here, the universal viewpoint is represented in the Romantic Sublime. Whereas the beautiful is something that we have power over. And so God himself is in no way beautiful or good. He is simply a form of power. And this presentation is characteristic of the presuppositions of the Enlightenment and have nothing to do with the God portrayed in Scripture, as I've said. But again, I think although we have something akin to a revisiting of Milton's themes of Paradise Lost, we have to see the context of the Enlightenment and its categories and its universal all relativizing worldview, and in particular its portrait of God as a power, but not with any personal characteristic, let alone those that are loving and benevolent and good. And so even the sacrifice that Cain, or rather Abel, makes is, in his brother Cain's estimation, a bloody one. So that suggests a cruel omnipotence that is asking for it. And the only thing that Cain can say about him is acknowledge that he is omnipotent, but that is all that he has. Abel is, of course, still kneeling. And when the fruits are scattered from Abel's, or rather Cain's offering, Abel speaks to his brother from his knees, "Oh, brother, pray Jehovah's wrath with thee." Cain, "Why so? Thy fruits are scattered on the earth." Cain, "From earth they came, to earth let them return," echoing the language of God himself when he pronounces the judgment of death upon Adam. From the earth he comes, and from the earth he will return, because Adam is clay. Cain is parodying this, and in a sense, there is a satanic parody in Cain's own words. "Their seed will bear fresh fruit ere the summer. Thy burnt off flesh offering prospers better. See how heaven licks up the flames when thick with blood." So God is being portrayed as this cosmic torturer and cosmic tyrant who loves blood and killing and murder. So again, the exact inversion of the biblical portrait of God, and rather the portrait of Lucifer himself, the way that Scripture portrays it. But again, from the vantage point of Byron and his portrait here, there's a total inversion. God is above the categories. He's beyond good and evil, to use Nietzsche's phrase. And as a consequence, to be God-like, as Nietzsche himself believes knowledge ought to be, we too must transcend the good and evil in their limited subjective capacities, and to dare to know, as Immanuel Kant enjoins us to do. What follows is the murder of Cain of Abel by Cain. And I'll pick this up in line 315. Abel opposing Cain, because Cain is, rather than putting his sacrifice back on the altar, is going to strew it on the earth, and a blasphemous act. Abel opposing him, I love God far more than life. Cain striking him with a brand on the temples, which he snatches from the altar. Then take thy life unto thy God, since he loves lives. Again. And then Abel falls. What hast thou done, my brother? Cain, immediately repenting, brother, O God, receive thy servant and forgive his slayer, for he knew not what he did. Echoing Jesus' words here. Cain, give me thy hand, and tell poor Zillah. And then Cain, after a moment's stupefaction, my hand, 'tis all red, and I mean, something of the Lady Macbeth line, there's blood and he can't get the blood off his hands. The sense of guilt here that comes to him in this moment, this fit of rage, not a contemplated act, not envious of his brother, but simply internally, as Byron portrays him, agitated by the conditions under which he operates as a finite mortal being on earth, the conditions that Byron himself rails against. This is the portrait here. And he says, what? Where am I? Cain. Alone? Where's Abel? Where? Cain. Can it be that I am he? My brother? Awake! Why liest thou so on the green earth? 'Tis not the hour of slumber. Why so pale? What hast thou? Thou art full of life this morn. Abel, I pray thee, mock me not. I smote too fiercely, but not fatally. Ah, why wouldst thou oppose me? This is mockery, and only done to daunt me. 'Twas a blow, and but a blow. Stir, stir, nay, only stir. Why so? That's well. Thou breathest. Breathe upon me, O God, O God. Abel very faintly. What's he who speaks of God? Thy murderer, said Cain. Then may God forgive him. Cain, comfort poor Zillah. She has but one brother. Suggesting that he, of course, should also take her as his wife. And then at that point, now, and then Abel dies. And I, none, as in no brother. Who makes me brotherless? His eyes are open. Then he is not dead. Death is like sleep, and sleep shuts down our lids. His lips, too, are apart. Why then he breathes, and yet I feel it not. His heart, let me see, doth it beat? Methinks, no, no, this is a vision, else I am become the native of another and worse world. The earth swims around me. What is this? This, 'tis wet. Puts his hand to his brow and then looks at it. And yet there are no dews. 'Tis blood, my blood, my brother's and my own, and shed by me. Then what have I further to do with life, since I have taken life from my own flesh? But he cannot be dead. Is silence death? No, we will wake. He will wake, and then let me watch by him. Life cannot be so slight as to be quenched thus quickly. He hath spoken to me since. What shall I say to him? My brother! No, he will not answer to that name, for brethren smite not each other. Yet, speak to me. Oh, for a word more of that gentle voice, that I may bear to hear my own again. And of course, Zillah comes in, and he is revealed to be the murderer that he is. Adam, Eve, Ada, and Zillah thereafter. And we find that not only is Cain condemned by God and cursed, but his parents begin the curse, which again moves outside of the account in Genesis 4. They curse him and banish him from their home, first of all. And Ada, Abel's wife, begs them to forgive. They won't forgive. Likewise, the angel of the Lord comes in. And again, the portrait here is adding to the sense of the injustice of the godly people and of God himself. He says that he's merciful, and yet there's no mercy for Cain, even though Cain himself is showing terrific remorse, and Abel himself calls out for him to be forgiven, which of course is not in the text again and echoes Jesus' words. But the angel of the Lord comes in, curses Cain, and as a punishment, we get more of what we have in Genesis 4, that the earth will never bear fruit when Cain attempts to cultivate it. And he will be a fugitive furthermore, because he's been banished now and forced to wander the earth. And of course, then the text in Scripture more or less takes over, because Ada, rather than Cain, it must be said, says that the punishment is too great to bear, and because people want to kill Cain for his crime, and the mark is then put on his brow so that he will not be harmed. And then they leave the stage together. So that is how the play more or less ends. And I think I've covered more or less the gist of what I wanted to. I wanted to give you an overview and a sense of the thematic significance of Byron's portrait in Cain, his presentation of God in sublime terms and Manichaean terms. Likewise, the Enlightenment aspects of his portrait and the way it presents the being of God and also of human nature, and the view of from nowhere, which has an effect on not only the sciences, which we can see in Cuvier and in the modern sciences, but in particular how it affects the human sciences and their portrait of human nature in a sort of spiritual, disembodied fashion, which we can compare most aptly to Gnosticism. But with that, I leave you, and we will pick it up next time. Thank you.